Think about the person in your life who everyone calls. Not for advice exactly. Not for solutions. For the specific thing that's harder to find than either of those. Someone who will actually listen. Who won't redirect the conversation to themselves. Who won't minimize what you're going through or rush you to a conclusion. Who will just hold it with you. Stay in it however long it takes, without making you feel like a burden for needing the time. You probably know who that person is in your circle. And there's a reasonable chance that person has their own version of that list. And it's much longer than yours. Because here's what's interesting about the person everyone goes to. They're not just emotionally generous. They're emotionally available in a way that functions almost like a professional skill. The ability to regulate their own reactions in order to stay present for someone else's, to read what the other person needs before it's been said, to create the particular quality of attention that makes people feel genuinely heard. That's not a common thing. And it's not an accident that they have it. Most people assume this kind of attunement is simply a personality trait. Something some people are born with, sensitivity, empathy, a natural openness to others' experiences. And for some, that's partly true. But for a much larger group, this level of emotional skill was learned. In a context that required it. Before it was ever praised for it. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild at UC Berkeley described something she called emotional labor, the management of feeling to fulfill the emotional requirements of a role. The work of monitoring and regulating one's own emotional expression in service of someone else's experience. Her research initially focused on professions, flight attendants, customer service workers, but the concept maps precisely onto what happens inside families where a child is required, by the emotional dynamics of the household, to become attuned to the adults around them. The child who had to know if a parent was in a good mood before speaking. Who learned to read the room before asking for anything. Who calibrated their approach, their tone, their timing, every single day, based on signals the adults around them may not even have been aware they were sending. That child was performing emotional labor before they had language for it. And they got extraordinarily good at it. One of the loneliest feelings in the world is being surrounded by people who need you. And realizing that none of them actually know you. They know what you do for them. They know how you show up. But the version of you that exists, when you're not being useful to anyone, that version most of them have never met. If that resonated, I've spent a long time writing about exactly this feeling. It's linked in the description. And in the first pinned comment. Neuroscientist Alan Shore at UCLA, whose research on early emotional development spans decades, has documented how the earliest experiences of emotional attunement, between infant and caregiver, literally shape the developing brain's capacity for reading and regulating affect. When that early environment requires a child to be hyper-attuned to the emotional states of others, the brain builds those circuits with particular intensity. The reading of faces, tones, silences. The monitoring of micro-expressions. The ability to detect before anything is said, that something is off. In childhood this was survival. In adulthood it becomes a gift. But a gift that was never freely given. It was forged under conditions. And it carries those conditions with it into every room it enters. Because the person who developed this skill didn't just develop the skill. They developed the orientation that goes with it. That the emotionally important information in the room lives in other people. That their job, when they enter a relational space, is to receive, to monitor, to hold. And that orientation, once established, tends to attract exactly the kind of person who most needs what it offers. Which is how someone becomes everyone's therapist without ever intending to. And here's the cost, because there always is one, and this one is specific. Emotional labor is depleting in a particular way. Not just because it takes energy, though it does, more than most people outside the role ever recognize. But because it's asymmetric. The person who is always holding space for others is rarely in a position to need it in return. The role itself prevents it. You can't be the safe person and the one who needs safety in the same relationship, at least not without the dynamic fundamentally changing. And so the person who is everyone's therapist often finds themselves in a strange position. They know the inner lives of their closest people with remarkable intimacy. The fears, the patterns, the things said at 2 a.m. that are never mentioned in daylight. And those same people, in most cases, know very little about what's actually happening inside them. Not because they're private exactly, but because they've been trained by the role itself to redirect, to minimize, to be fine because fine is what the role requires. And the specific loneliness that comes from this, being the person everyone trusts, and simultaneously the person no one actually knows, is one of the quieter tragedies of this pattern. Because it looks, from the outside, like an abundance of connection. All those people who call. All that trust. All that closeness. But closeness isn't symmetrical if only one person is ever vulnerable. And the person who has been everyone's safe space for long enough often reaches a point where they can no longer remember if they've ever had one. But here's what almost nobody tells the person who fills this role. The availability wasn't randomly generous. And it wasn't just personality. It formed in a context that needed it. And the pattern didn't end when that context did. It just found new rooms to repeat itself in. Because the same attunement that made them indispensable in the original environment makes them detectable, from a distance, to people who are looking for exactly what they offer. Someone who will receive. Who won't burden. Who will be there. And that match happens again and again in friendships and relationships, quietly replicating the original arrangement. Someone who needs and someone who holds. Until the person doing the holding, eventually, runs out of something they never had enough of to begin with. And here's what makes that depletion specific and different from ordinary exhaustion. Ordinary exhaustion responds to rest. You stop, you sleep, you recover something. The depletion that accumulates from years of emotional labor, from being the one who holds always without being held in return, doesn't respond the same way. Because what's been consumed isn't just energy. It's the sense that the relationship is mutual, that the care moves in both directions, that the investment is something other than one-sided. And that's a different thing to refill. The person who is everyone's therapist often doesn't realize, until something forces the accounting, how few of their relationships have ever moved in both directions. They've been so organized around the role, so fluent in the particular skills it requires, that the absence of reciprocity became invisible to them. Just how things are. Just how their connections have always felt. But when they finally stop long enough to notice, what they see is a relational landscape that contains very little of what they have, in enormous quantities given away. Not nothing, but not enough. Not the kind of specific returned attention that makes a person feel known, rather than merely useful, merely available, merely good at the thing they've always been good at. And there's a very specific quality to what's missing in that relational landscape. Something that takes a long time to name, because it sits just outside the vocabulary most people in this pattern have been given to describe their experience. It's not that no one has ever cared for them. Many people have. It's that the care has almost always moved in one direction. And care that flows in only one direction isn't connection in the full sense. It's something closer to being valued for what you provide rather than for what you are. The difference between those two things is the whole difference. Alan Shore's research on early emotional development points to something that matters here. The brain's capacity for feeling genuinely held, the neurological experience of being in contact with someone who is both present and responsive, requires actual reciprocity to develop fully. The same circuits that build the skill of attuning to others need to be activated in the receiving direction as well. When the attuning is always outward, when the emotional traffic has consistently moved toward others and not back toward the self, those receiving circuits remain, over time, underused. This is not irreversible. But it means the person who is everyone's therapist is not just relationally depleted. They are, in a specific sense, less practiced at receiving than at giving. And practice is what changes this. Not insight alone, though insight helps. Practice. The experience, accumulated through actual interactions, of being on the receiving end of the kind of presence they've spent a lifetime providing. That's not a small ask of the pattern, but it's a specific one. And specific is always better than vague. There's a cost to always being the one who carries things. And it's not the obvious kind. Doesn't show up overnight. It shows up slowly. As resentment you can't explain. As exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. As a version of yourself that has quietly disappeared. Inside everyone else's needs. I've gone deeper into this cost than I can cover in one video. It's all linked in the description and in the first pinned comment. Now I want to speak to you directly. Think about the last time you called someone the way people call you. Not to share good news. Not to check in casually. But the specific call, the one where you say, "I'm not okay and I need someone to sit with me in it for a while." Do you have that person? And if you do, when's the last time you actually made that call? Or did you find a reason it wasn't the right moment? They had their own things, you didn't want to be a burden, you could handle it. And if you don't have that person, do you know why? Not as a question of blame. As a question of pattern. Because the person who becomes everyone's therapist often, in the same process, stops being someone who asks for the thing they spend their whole life giving. They unlearn the reach outward. They develop a fluency in receiving others' needs that has no equivalent in expressing their own. And the relationships they build reflect that. Full of people they know well. And no one who knows them the same way back. That asymmetry is not inevitable. It's the result of a role that was taken on, or assigned, long before there was a choice about whether to accept it. And you are allowed to renegotiate it. Not by becoming less available to the people who need you, but by letting some of them, the ones who have earned it, see you on the days when you're the one who needs the space. It will feel uncomfortable, probably for both of you. And it might be the most important thing you let yourself do. If something in this video found you today, leave a comment. Tell me, when was the last time someone held space for you the way you hold it for everyone else? I read every one. Subscribe if you haven't, because next week we go into what happens inside the body when you spend years being the strong, present, available one. Something accumulates. And it's not nothing.